You are standing in front of your house right now, or your apartment, or whatever space you call home. Look at it for a second. The walls, the roof, the door that closes and locks, the windows that let in light but keep out wind. The insulation you've never seen but trust is doing its job somewhere inside those walls. The foundation that keeps the whole thing from sinking into the earth. Now imagine that none of it exists. Not just your specific house, all of it. Every architectural technique, every engineered material, every building technology that humans have accumulated over 10,000 years of settled civilization, gone. You have what you can find, what you can cut, what you can carry, and what you can figure out with your hands and your mind, and whatever knowledge your community has accumulated and passed down to you. And it is minus 30 degrees outside. The wind has been blowing for 4 days. The nearest natural cave is 60 kilometers away, and almost certainly occupied by a cave bear who has opinions about sharing. What do you build? This is the problem that ancient humans solved during the Ice Age. Not once, not in one place, not by one group of people who got lucky and figured it out. Over and over again, across thousands of years, across a landscape that stretched from Western Europe to the far reaches of Siberia, ancient humans built shelters that kept them alive through conditions that would kill an unprotected modern human in hours. And what they built, what archaeologists have painstakingly uncovered and reconstructed from the evidence left in the frozen ground, is nothing like what most people imagine when they picture Ice Age human habitation. This is not a story about caves. Well, it's a little about caves. But mostly it's a story about engineering, ingenuity, and the extraordinary capacity of ancient humans to look at the raw materials of a frozen world and turn them into something that worked. Let's start with what the Ice Age landscape actually looked like, because context matters enormously here. The last glacial maximum, the peak of the most recent Ice Age, occurred roughly 26,000 to 19,000 years ago. At its height, ice sheets up to 3 kilometers thick covered most of northern Europe, Canada, and large parts of northern Asia. The global average temperature was approximately 6 degrees Celsius colder than today. Sea levels were about 120 meters lower than they are now, exposing vast areas of continental shelf as dry land. The landscape that ancient humans inhabited during this period was not uniformly frozen wasteland. It was predominantly what researchers call the mammoth steppe, a vast, cold, dry grassland ecosystem stretching from Western Europe across Asia and into North America. Think less polar ice cap, more frozen Mongolian steppe, open, windswept, bitterly cold in winter, but also extraordinarily productive in terms of large animal biomass. Woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, cave lions, giant deer, horses, reindeer, bison, musk oxen, all living and moving across this landscape in numbers that are hard to imagine from the perspective of the modern world. Ancient humans were not just surviving on the edges of this landscape. They were living in it, hunting in it, raising children in it, making art in it. And the shelter strategies they developed were calibrated specifically for its conditions. Minimal trees in many areas, abundant large animal bones and hides, permafrost that made excavation difficult but also preserved materials that would otherwise have rotted, and winters of a severity that demanded engineering solutions, not just makeshift windbreaks. Yes, let's talk about caves, because I said this wasn't mainly about caves, and then I'm going to spend time on caves anyway, because that's how caves work. They are very compelling. Caves were, when available, genuinely excellent Ice Age shelter options, and ancient humans used them extensively. The cave sites of southwestern France, northern Spain, and parts of Central Europe contain some of the richest evidence of ancient human habitation anywhere on Earth. Sites like Lascaux, Altamira, and Font de Gaume are famous for their art. But the art is, in some ways, secondary to the more fundamental fact: these caves were homes. People lived in them, slept in them, made tools in them, processed food in them, raised children in them, and came back to them year after year across generations. But here's what most people miss about cave habitation. Ancient humans didn't just move into a cave and call it done. They modified and furnished their cave spaces extensively. They built internal structures. We find post holes, hearth arrangements, and distributions of debris that indicate the construction of internal windbreaks, sleeping platforms, and work areas within cave spaces. They hung hides across cave entrances to block wind and retain heat. They arranged hearths for maximum heating efficiency, often in positions that took advantage of natural rock surfaces for radiant heat reflection. And they selected their caves carefully. Not every cave is a good Ice Age shelter. A cave facing north is cold and dark. A cave with poor ventilation fills with smoke from the fires you need to stay alive. A cave with a flooded lower level is a cold, damp misery. Ancient humans chose caves, when they had options, based on criteria that modern architecture students would recognize. Orientation to maximize solar gain on south-facing slopes, ceiling height that allowed smoke to stratify above the living level, proximity to water and food resources, defensibility from predators, and internal geometry that allowed efficient use of fire heat. The art in the deep chambers of painted caves, Chauvet, Lascaux, Altamira, was not made in living spaces. It was made in deliberately accessed ritual or ceremonial spaces deep within cave systems. The living happened near the entrance, in the zone of light and warmth and practical activity. The art happened in the dark interior, reached by torchlight, in spaces that required effort and intention to reach. The cave was not just a shelter. It was a complex, differentiated space with different zones for different human activities. Exactly what we would expect from a cognitively sophisticated species that organized its activities by context and purpose. Now, the mammoth-bone houses. This is the part where things get genuinely extraordinary. And I want to make sure you understand just how remarkable these structures are. In the late 1960s and subsequently through the following decades, Ukrainian and Russian archaeologists excavating sites along river systems in what is now Ukraine uncovered something that completely changed our understanding of Ice Age human habitation. At sites including Mezhyrich, Mezin, Dobranichevka, and Gontsy, all dating to roughly 14,000 to 18,000 years ago, they found the remains of circular structures built from mammoth bones. Not a few bones lying around, not scattered remains from butchery, deliberately, carefully, architecturally arranged mammoth bones, used as structural building materials in configurations that could only have resulted from intentional, planned construction. The structure at Mezhyrich, perhaps the best studied, had a foundation ring made of interlocked mammoth lower jaw bones, arranged in a herringbone pattern that created a stable, interlocking base. Mammoth skulls were positioned at regular intervals to serve as structural anchors. Long bones, femurs, tibias, were stacked and arranged as walls. Mammoth shoulder blades and pelvises were used as roofing elements or structural connectors. The tusks, curved and strong, served as arched structural supports for the roof. The total bone inventory at the Mezhyrich site represents approximately 95 individual mammoths. 95. Some of these bones showed weathering patterns suggesting they had been collected from natural death sites rather than fresh kills. Mammoth carcasses encountered on the landscape and systematically stripped of useful structural material and transported to the construction site. The effort required to gather, transport, and arrange this material was enormous. This was not improvised shelter making. This was construction on a scale, and with a level of planning that we associate, in our cultural assumptions, with much later periods of human history. The dimensions of these structures were substantial, diameters ranging from 4 to 7 meters, large enough to shelter multiple people comfortably, with space for hearths, sleeping areas, tool-making zones, and food storage. The interior floor areas were larger than many modern urban studio apartments, a fact that I find both impressive and slightly depressing. The bone walls would have been covered, almost certainly with mammoth hides, possibly with sod or earth as additional insulation. Experiments and calculations suggest that a structure of this design with a fire inside could maintain interior temperatures dramatically above the outside air, even in conditions of extreme cold. We're talking about the difference between surviving and dying, between a space where you can sleep, eat, work, and raise children, and exposure to conditions that kill. Let's talk about the engineering intelligence embedded in these structures, because this deserves explicit recognition. The builders of the mammoth-bone houses understood structural mechanics. They knew, through accumulated knowledge and observation, that interlocking elements create more stable structures than parallel stacked ones. The herringbone pattern of the jawbone foundation at Mezhyrich is not aesthetically motivated. It is mechanically motivated. Interlocked jawbones resist lateral displacement better than jawbones laid end to end. Someone figured this out, probably through trial and error over generations, and the knowledge became embedded in the construction practice. They understood thermal architecture. The circular floor plan is not arbitrary. A circular structure has the minimum perimeter for a given floor area of any shape, which means the minimum surface area through which heat can escape. Circular shelters are more thermally efficient than rectangular ones, a fact that modern passive house designers know, and that ancient Ice Age builders appear to have arrived at independently through the same logic of practical optimization. They understood material selection. Mammoth bones are not all equivalent as building materials. Different bones have different structural properties, different strengths, different flexibilities, different shapes and dimensions. The builders of these structures selected specific bone types for specific structural roles, suggesting a working taxonomy of building materials based on empirical knowledge of how those materials behave under load. This is engineering. Not engineering in the sense of formal education and professional certification. Engineering in the fundamental sense of applying systematic knowledge about materials and forces to the problem of creating stable, functional structures. The people who built the mammoth-bone houses of the Ukrainian steppe were engineers. They just worked with bones instead of steel. Now let's move to the forested regions of Ice Age Europe. Because in areas where timber was available, ancient humans built wooden structures that were just as sophisticated in their own way, and which are, in some respects, even harder to study because wood preserves far less reliably than bone. The evidence for Ice Age wooden shelters comes from post holes, the dark stains in ancient soil where wooden posts were set into the ground, and from the distribution of cultural material around central hearths in ways that imply enclosed spaces. At sites in Central and Eastern Europe, including locations in the Czech Republic, Germany, and Poland, archaeologists have identified the footprints of structures that used wooden posts as their primary structural elements, covered with bark, hides, and other perishable materials. At the site of Ohalo II in modern Israel, dating to about 23,000 years ago, and extraordinarily well preserved because it was submerged beneath lake sediment, 6 brush hut structures have been excavated in remarkable detail. These oval structures, approximately 3 to 4 meters in their longest dimension, were made from branches bent and woven into a domed frame, creating a flexible, wind-resistant structure whose organic aerodynamics shed wind load rather than resisting it directly. The floor of one structure showed evidence of grass bedding, a sleeping surface of gathered grass that insulated against the cold ground and provided comfort. The Ohalo II site is particularly remarkable because its preservation allows us to see not just the structure itself, but how it was furnished and used. Hearths inside and immediately outside the structures, ground stone tools for processing plant foods, animal bones from the meals prepared and eaten there. The spatial arrangement of these elements tells us about how the interior space was organized. The same kind of spatial organization that we impose on our own living spaces, dividing them into functional zones for different activities. Let's talk about something that doesn't get enough attention in discussions of ancient. Shelter, the semi-subterranean structure. One of the most effective strategies for cold climate shelter construction is to excavate into the earth. Not deep, you don't need to go far. Even going down half a meter to a meter below the surface dramatically changes the thermal environment of a structure. The earth has thermal mass, it stores heat and releases it slowly. Below the frost line, ground temperature stays relatively constant year-round, hovering around the mean annual air temperature for a given location. In a climate where surface air temperatures swing from +20 in summer to -30 in winter, the ground at a depth of a meter or two sits at something like -2 or -3 degrees Celsius year-round. That's cold, but it's not -30. And a structure insulated by earth on multiple sides requires far less fire heat to maintain a survivable interior temperature. Ancient humans in cold climate regions used this principle extensively. Archaeological evidence from multiple Ice Age sites shows structures where the floor was excavated below the surrounding ground level, creating a dug-in living space where the earth walls provided insulation and wind protection. Combined with a superstructure of bone, wood, or hide above ground level, these semi-subterranean structures represent an elegant exploitation of natural thermal properties. There is also evidence that ancient humans used natural topographic features to enhance their shelters. Building against a south-facing rock face means you have one wall already built for you. A wall with enormous thermal mass that absorbs solar heat during the day and radiates it back through the night. Building in a hollow or depression provides natural wind protection. Locating a structure in a position sheltered by a ridgeline from the prevailing wind direction reduces wind chill dramatically. The placement of Ice Age habitation sites is not random. When researchers map the locations of ancient cold climate sites onto topographic data, clear patterns emerge, clustering on south-facing slopes, in sheltered valleys, near water sources, in positions that balance access to resources against protection from the elements. This is site selection knowledge, systematic understanding of how local topography affects microclimate, accumulated over generations, and embedded in the cultural knowledge of groups who returned to the same favorable locations year after year. Storage is a dimension of Ice Age shelter that often gets overlooked but is absolutely critical to cold climate survival. A shelter is not just a space to sleep and stay warm. It is, in the Ice Age context, a food processing and storage facility, a tool-making workshop, and a repository for the accumulated material resources that a group depends on for survival. Managing these functions within the limited space of an Ice Age shelter required organizational intelligence and spatial planning. Food storage in the Ice Age was assisted by the environment in a way that modern cold climate peoples still exploit. Permafrost. In areas with permafrost, the ground below a certain depth is permanently frozen, and a pit dug into permafrost functions as a natural freezer. Ancient humans appear to have used permafrost pits for food storage, caching large quantities of meat and fat from successful hunts for later consumption during periods when hunting was poor or impossible. At Mezhirish and related sites, the arrangement of the mammoth-bone structures and associated pits suggests a sophisticated use of outdoor and semi-outdoor space for food storage and processing. The cold was not just an enemy to be defended against, it was also a resource, a refrigeration system that extended the usable life of meat and fat beyond what would be possible in warmer conditions. Ancient cold climate hunters could hunt intensively during the autumn, when large animals were at peak fat condition, and cache the results for consumption across the winter months. The shelter complex was as much a food management center as a sleeping space. Let's talk about what happens inside these shelters, because the interior life of an Ice Age shelter tells us as much about ancient humans as the structure itself. The hearth is the center of the Ice Age interior. Not metaphorically, literally. In virtually every Ice Age shelter with evidence of a hearth, the hearth is positioned near the center of the usable interior space, positioned to maximize heat distribution and to provide a focal point for the social activity organized around it. The evidence of hearth use in Ice Age sites is among the most consistent and abundant evidence we have. Ash deposits, burned bone, charred plant material, reddened and heat-fractured stone. Around the hearth, we find tool-making debris, the tiny flakes and chips of napping stone that accumulate around the spot where someone sat for hours, carefully striking and pressure flaking stone into usable tools. We find the remains of worked bone and antler, the debris of fashioning needles, awls, harpoon points, and ornaments. We find the traces of hide working, ochre for tanning, stone scrapers worn to characteristic profiles by the specific motion of scraping hides, bone tools for softening leather. The Ice Age shelter was a workshop. In the long winter evenings when the light was poor and travel was impossible, people sat around the fire and made things. They made the tools and clothing and weapons that would be needed when the weather broke and life became active again. They told stories, the knowledge transmission that kept survival information alive across generations. They sang. They made music on instruments like the bone flutes found at Ice Age sites across Europe and Asia. They maintained and repaired the social bonds that held the community together through the enforced proximity of winter cohabitation. The Ice Age shelter was also a canvas. Ochre, the same red iron oxide pigment used in cave art, is found at habitation sites in forms suggesting it was used to decorate objects, hides, and possibly the interior surfaces of shelters themselves. Personal ornaments, perforated teeth, and shells and carved ivory beads are found in Ice Age habitation contexts, suggesting that people adorned themselves even in the confined, intimate space of a winter shelter. The interior of an Ice Age home was not the bare, stripped-down survival pod of popular imagination. It was a decorated, organized, culturally rich space that reflected the aesthetic sensibilities and social identities of the people who lived in it. Let me bring you back to the opening. You are standing in front of your house. The walls, the roof, the door that locks. Now you understand, in a way you maybe didn't before, where all of that comes from. Not in the direct historical sense. Modern architecture has its own lineage of development over 10,000 years of settled civilization. But in the deeper sense of the problem being solved, the problem is this: the human body is fragile in the cold. The human body needs shelter to survive in conditions that a large fraction of the Earth's surface routinely presents. And ancient humans solved that problem. Not once, not with one solution, but with a range of solutions adapted to different landscapes, different available materials, different specific conditions, with such effectiveness that they lived, and hunted and raised children and made extraordinary art in environments that should have been beyond the reach of a tropical primate with no fur and a dangerously large brain. The mammoth-bone houses of the Ukrainian steppe were not primitive huts. They were engineered thermal environments built from the best available materials using sophisticated structural knowledge accumulated over generations. The semi-subterranean wooden structures of forested Ice Age Europe were not random constructions. They were carefully sited, thermally optimized living spaces designed around the specific requirements of cold climate survival. The caves of southwestern France were not just holes in rock. They were carefully selected, actively modified, spatially organized homes, decorated with art of breathtaking ambition and skill. Ancient humans were not lucky to survive the Ice Age. They were skilled, they were knowledgeable, they were adaptive, creative, and practically intelligent in ways that translate directly into what we would recognize today as architectural competence. They looked at the materials available to them in one of the harshest environments in which humans have ever lived, and they built homes, real homes, warm, organized, decorated, socially rich spaces that sheltered communities across the longest and coldest winters the planet has produced in the past 100,000 years. The cave bear in that cave 60 kilometers away can keep it. You've got something better.